I'm going to anoint you now. Of 1988. I know in the summer of 1988, some of you weren't even born, and some of you were young pups. But anyhow, in the summer of 1988, I was just finishing my first year of seminary. Seminary is a 3-year program of training for pastors and ministers, and I was about to begin my first summer pastorate. Now, summer pastorates were the 2 summers between the 3 years where we went out and did like an internship, actually in a church under the leadership of a seasoned pastor, where we got to preach, where we got to do pastoral care, where we got to be supervised, where we got to run programs and visit and do all the things that pastors do. And I never will forget that experience. Nor will I forget the very first morning I was there. That's 30 plus years ago, 31 years ago. I had driven all night long from Oak Brook, Illinois. Our seminary was 28 miles west of Chicago. And the way that worked, when we came home, I was young and dumb then. I left at 6 in the evening, right after rush hour traffic had kind of subsided. And I drove all night long to come here. It was 15 hours, and that time to that location in central Pennsylvania, it was about a 12-hour drive. I had driven all night long. My brain and mind and eyes were a little bit foggy from driving all night long. You know, when you drive steady on the highway, at least I do, I kind of zone. And so I remember I was at the top of the mountain. I was about to descend into the cove. Now, a cove is different from a valley because a cove in that area, there were mountains all the way around it, and there was one natural gap at the top, the north of the cove, and one natural gap between the mountains where you could go through on a road. Otherwise, you had to cross over a mountain. And so I was crossing over the mountain, coming down into the cove area, and as the sun was breaking, it was sunrise. It was like 5:30, 6-ish in the morning, and it was a little bit of misty, foggy like environment. Maybe it's my memory, but anyhow, it just seemed foggy a little bit, and it was beautiful. There were lots of farms with lush green pastures and pretty black and white Holstein cows out in the pastures, red barns, and those beautiful old stone farmhouses was the scenery that I was driving through on the way to the church that I was to be summer pastored at. And that was before GPS in those days. And so I had written directions, and so I was following these directions to a T. I arrived at the church at 5:36 in the morning, and I'll never forget that the pastor, who I had never met and had only spoken to twice on the phone before, walked out on the porch and stood there greeting me. And when he walked out and leaned on the porch rail and welcomed me to New Enterprise, Pennsylvania, that person that I saw looked just like Radar O'Reilly on MASH. And the odd thing is, Jim, the pastor, was from Iowa. And I thought to myself, what in the world have I gotten myself into? I mean, because you know Radar. If you've seen MASH, I mean, he's about as ditzy as they come. I mean, not as bad as Klinger, but you know, I was just like, wow, what in the world is this experience going to be like? And Jim welcomed me into his house. We sat down at the table. We had coffee and breakfast and got acquainted with one another. And then after it was about 8 o'clock, when we thought for sure the people that I was going to live with all summer long would be awake. Now, in truth, they were old retired farmers, so they had probably been awake since I drove by their house on the way to the parsonage. But anyhow, we waited till about 8 o'clock, and Jim drove me up the valley to their home, about a mile, and introduced me to Mac and Marie Drake. Now, Mac Drake and Marie were old, retired farmers. They had had 8 children 4 of whom had died at various stages in young ages, and one of them in a very tragic farm accident, and they were still kind of affected by that. But they were the most loving, gracious, welcoming people. But Mac had this edge about him. He had this way. He told you exactly what he was thinking, whether you wanted to hear it or not. He told you exactly how he was thinking. And so I'll never, ever forget as we walked into his house, and he said to me, he recited this story to me the first time, and he recited it again and again and again. He recited it when he met Sharon, because we were dating at that point. She was about 30 miles away at another church in Everett, Pennsylvania. He recited it when I took him home and Marie home to meet my parents. He recited it when anybody that I knew came to visit. And basically he said, "We are glad you're here. We couldn't have you sleeping under a tree." And then he went on. He said, "When the pastor, Jim Radar, announced that you were coming and that they would need housing for you, no one came forward." Talk about a welcome. I mean, he said it like it was. He said, nobody wanted you. He said, "We just couldn't have that. We couldn't have you sleeping under a tree." And that's exactly his words. We couldn't have you with no place to lay your head. So he said, we stood up and said, we'd be delighted to host you. How's that for a welcome? Interesting thing is, we became dear friends in the course of that 10 weeks. They became like my grandparents, and I became like one of their many grandchildren. In fact, years later, when they both died, I was able to do one of their funerals, and the other one I was on a trip, scheduled to leave on a plane, and was unable to be there at the point the funeral was to be. And I even had the honor of marrying several of their grandchildren, officiating their grandchildren's wedding. The other interesting thing is that after that summer, even now, if I went back, and a lot of the people are gone, but if the people remembered me and were still there, I would have a dozen or half a dozen places to stay. It's amazing how that works when the fear of the unknown goes away. But I was grateful for Mac and Marie and their welcome and their willingness to give me a place and to open their arms wide. And I'll tell you what, anything they had that I wanted, they'd have given it to me. That summer I watched Marie make a quilt. Took her all summer long. And she sold it to me for $200, and it was my engagement gift to Sharon when we got engaged later in the fall. Sharon didn't know that that's why I was buying it, and it's on our bed yet today. It's getting a little tattered, but it's a beautiful quilt, and $200 for a whole summer's worth of work, 8 hours a day sitting there putting these little stitches in. And that doesn't even count the time it took to put the pieces together and cut the pieces out. And it's just a fabulously beautiful quilt. They welcomed me. They opened their arms wide and embraced me. Today is week 2 of our series, At the Core of Joy. And today we're talking about open arms. Core values are behaviors that we seek to be a natural part of who we are and what we do as a church and as individuals. They define who we are becoming. They're not words on a wall or on our website or in a brochure. They are behaviors that we live. And last week we began an 8-week series looking at the core values of Community of Joy. And as I told you last week, and I'll tell you again this week, and I'll probably tell you all 8 weeks, all 8 of those core values are 2 words, except one core value is 3 words. And I did that intentionally because they're easy to remember that way. If I wrote a paragraph, you wouldn't remember the paragraph. I wouldn't remember the paragraph. And so I thought, let's make these core values 2 words or 3 words, as in the one case, so that we can remember them. Because if they're going to be behaviors that we live, we have to know what we're aspiring to. We have to know what they are. They are modeled after Jesus. I mean, we are a Christian church. Shouldn't our core values be modeled after Jesus? And our very first and always first core value, which we talked about last week, is always Jesus. Because all that we do, all that we're about, all that we say is always done to honor and live like Jesus. He's our leader. He's our Lord. He's our example. He's everything. Again and again in the New Testament, we see Jesus throwing open wide his arms in welcome and grace. He breaks the mold, and he calls his followers, us, to do the same. The story of Zacchaeus, which Pastor Sharon read a little while ago, better known as Zach. Zach that story has been a long favorite of Sunday school teachers. Perhaps because Zach was a little guy and Jesus welcomed him. And Sunday school children are little people and they want to communicate this welcome. Perhaps you've even sung Zach's song, you know? Zacchaeus was a wee little man was he. He climbed up in a sycamore tree for the Lord he wanted to see. And as the Savior came that way, he looked up in the tree and, you got the motions. And he said, Zacchaeus, you come down for I'm going to your house today. I'm going to your house today. Did you sing that as a kid growing up? Yeah, I did. I mean, that's part of why we like Zacchaeus. Or Zach, as I'm calling him. But I find our fascination with the story of Zach interesting because while we like it, we don't live its message very well. Zach was a known entity in that region. He was hated by most. Do you know how I know that? It doesn't say that. Luke didn't say he was hated necessarily. He does say they grumbled and said he was a notorious sinner, but he was hated because he was the chief tax collector. Now, on April 15th, you had to pay your taxes. How many enjoyed that experience, right? I mean, nobody likes to pay taxes, but we all like to have the benefits of our taxes, right? I mean, they're a necessary thing. But see, the different in that day than now, the chief tax collector and all tax collectors had a freedom that the tax collectors today don't have. The government that sanctioned the tax collectors and gave them ability to do their work said, okay, if Kelly owes the government $100 and I'm the tax collector, I'm Zach, I can tell Kelly, you owe me $200, and if you don't pay me $200, I'm going to impose some punishment on you. And so she had to pay me $200. I gave the $100 that she owes to the government, and the other $100 was mine. Now, who would like that? I mean, Zach liked it, but he was the only one that liked it. Nobody. That's why they hated him, because he did that all the time to everybody. He got from them more than they owed the government. No one likes tax collectors. So Zach was a hated man, but he must have heard good things about Jesus. I mean, why else would a notorious sinner, a hated man, go to such extremes just to see Jesus? Luke tells us a lot of details. He tells us some significant things. He tells us that Zach was a small man and the crowd was great and he couldn't see Jesus as he was passing by, so he ran ahead down the road a little ways where the crowd wasn't. And he climbed up in a sycamore fig tree because he wanted to see Jesus as he passed by. Now, perhaps he also thought, I'll be hiding up here. When I climb a tree, I'm hiding from the deer so that they'll walk closer. So maybe Zach was hiding from Jesus. He just wanted to see him, but he didn't want to have an interaction with him because, he's a hated man. He knew that. But he heard some good things about Jesus probably, so he climbs up in this tree in hopes of seeing him. And imagine his surprise, and imagine the surprise of everybody else when Jesus stops at the base of the tree and looks up and says, Zach, come down. I'm going to be a guest in your house today. I imagine he was beyond surprised. I imagine he was shocked. What would you do if Jesus said to you as you left here today, I'm coming to your house right now? Is it clean? Got dishes in the sink? We do. How about feeding him? What are you going to give him to eat? You see? I suspect that Zach and the crowd were not only surprised, they were shocked that Jesus invited himself to Zach's house for lunch. Zach climbed down and took Jesus home, and the crowd didn't like it one bit, for Luke tells us that they grumbled, saying he's gone to be the guest of a notorious sinner. So the first thing we learn from the story of Zach is that Jesus sees us differently than the world sees us. The world sees a hated tax collector, a notorious sinner. But Jesus sees someone in need of grace, someone to love, someone of worth and value. And I'm not talking about a monetary value. So Jesus opens his arms wide to Zach and welcomes him. Jesus sees us differently than the world, and he opens his arms wide to us and welcomes us. And I don't know about you, but I'm grateful for that reality. So as followers of Jesus, then, we must have open arms too. At the core of joy, I believe, are people who have open arms. The second thing we learn from Zach's story is how good it feels to be welcomed with open arms. Zach enjoyed that welcome. And we do too. Who doesn't like to be welcomed in? We hated it on the playground when we were playing soccer or baseball or kickball or whatever, and we chose teams, right? I was not athletic at all. And I hated playing those games because I was always one of the last ones to get chosen when we did that thing that we do, that ritual that we do on playgrounds. Who doesn't like to be welcomed and embraced? And if we want that welcome in our lives, don't you think other people want that welcome and deserve that welcome? If we feel we deserve that welcome, ought we extend that welcome to others? At the core of joy are people with open arms. Now, the third thing we learn from Zach's story is that Jesus' welcome opens the door to transformation. Luke tells us that the world grumbled, that Jesus ate with Zach, and as they were together, as Zach felt the open arm reception of Jesus that day, he experienced the transformative power of grace and love. Did you catch what he did? What Zach did? Jesus invited himself to his home for lunch to be his guest. And when they're standing there, Zach says to Jesus, Lord, I'm going to give half of everything I own to the poor. Well, that's a lot. He was a rich guy. Luke tells us that. And he says, if And I think this is funny because if Zach knew that it wasn't an if, he should have said, and I will give back 4 times what I took from everybody I took from. But he did say, if I've taken unfairly from people, I'm going to give back 4 times what I've taken. So, and then Jesus says, today, salvation has come to this house. That's Jesus' response to that declaration of Zach. Salvation has come to this home today, and this man has shown himself to be a true son of Abraham. A true son of Abraham. What Jesus is saying there is, he's one of us now. He's welcomed in. For the Son of Man came to seek and save those who are lost. Amazing how open arms leads to transformation, grace, and salvation. Not only in Zach's life, but in ours. It's one of the huge reasons why, as a pastor, I keep pushing us to suspend judgment and extend the grace of God and let that grace be unleashed on notorious sinners. Because we can trust God to do His work best. It's not our job to judge others. That job belongs to Jesus alone, and His standard, unlike our standard, His standard is grace, unmerited favor. By the world's standard, Zach didn't deserve to have Jesus in his home. He didn't deserve to even have a conversation with Jesus. He didn't deserve to be welcomed with open arms, but by Jesus' standards, and because Jesus sees us differently than the world, he was welcomed with open arms and experienced the transforming power of grace and love in his life. Again and again, we see this with Jesus. It's not just with Zach. It's not just a one-time occurrence. If it were just with Zach, I might not have made open arms one of our core values. But again and again, we see it with Jesus. We see it in John 8. You know, the story of the woman who was caught in the act of adultery. And she was about to be stoned, and the religious leaders gathered, and they brought Jesus into the situation, and they said, Jesus, the law of Moses says that this woman who was caught in the act of adultery needs to be stoned. And we wonder, where was the man? And we know he was there. They caught him too because she was caught in the act, it says. But the law didn't say anything about the man. He got a free ride. The woman was the one who gets in trouble, and so the law says to stone her. And so they say to Jesus, what do you say? Jesus bends down and writes in the sand. And then he stands up when he has their attention. I mean, that's all that moment was. You can speculate what he was writing in the sand all you want. We don't know. But I think he was just trying to get their attention because Jesus was a masterful teacher. He waited. They asked him a question and he was down drawing in the sand. And I can imagine them looking down to see what he's writing, and he's just doodling. And then he stands up after he's got their attention and he says, let the one without sin throw the first stone. And then he squatted down again and starts drawing in the sand. And after a while, then he stands up and he looks, and there's nobody standing there. Nobody's thrown a stone. And it's only him and the woman. And he says to the woman, woman, where are your accusers? Did no one throw a stone? And she said, no. And he said, well, I'm not going to accuse you either. Go and sin no more. Now that go and sin no more, it's a command. It's a goal. It's an invitation to live differently. And I'll bet you she heard it differently than if Jesus had said it before. He did what he did with the let the one who is without sin throw the first stone. You see, the invitation is heard differently when it's accompanied with a welcome and open arms. At the core of joy are people who have open arms. Open arms invites us to see people as Jesus sees them, in need of grace. That's me. That's you. I don't know about you, but I'm grateful every day for the grace that Jesus extends to me. I don't deserve it, but grace isn't deserved. I need it. I like it. All of us need that same grace in our lives. All of us. And so as a church, we're called to be a church with open arms, with welcome, love, and grace. Tuesday evening, Pinehurst Elementary School first graders came to the Camden Community Garden for a reading night in the garden, and I invited them to plant our 100 tomato plants. Now, they didn't plant all of them. There were some Salisbury University honor students who had come to help, and they also helped plant, but we got all 100 of the tomato plants planted. And also that night, because I wasn't needed to help them as much we had plenty of help. We didn't have as many kids as we thought we were going to have. And so I wasn't needed. So I went to the bed next to the tomato beds and planted 26 eggplants. That was on Tuesday. On Thursday, when I got home from being in D.C. at the Children's Hospital with Anna, who had open heart surgery, on Tuesday, SU honor students had a work night to help build some of the garden beds. And so I got there, and when we were done, I walked over to the eggplant bed, and I noticed that there were divots where every plant was, and there was no plant. And so I thought, wow, that's interesting. I know I planted eggplants there. What's going on? And so I got looking, and there were these 26 eggplants, probably about $100 worth. Those plants are worth $354 a piece. Not what I paid for them. I paid 35 cents a piece for them, plus I bought the seeds. But that's what they're worth. They were laying on the ground, and they hadn't just been pulled up. If they had just been pulled up, I probably could have stuck them back in. But I don't know if you remember Thursday, but it was like, we're in spring, but it was like summer. I saw 91 on Emma's car as I was driving it home, 91 degrees. Well, it doesn't take long in 91 degree temperature for that little root ball to get fried. And those eggplants were way beyond. And I was livid. I went to Rody Joe's for lunch, for supper that night because Sharon had already eaten. And I was hungry, and so I went there and had their Rody's broccoli, which I absolutely love. And I was fuming. Who did this? I mean, in the past, we've had one plant out of a bed or two plants out of a bed, but this was 26 plants. This was a whole bed. I'm like, what's going on? And so on Friday, I went to Pinehurst with Bob, and we mentored. We've been mentoring two brothers, and lately we've been mentoring only one of them. And so the youngest brother, we were mentoring him, and I said to him, do you know anything? He lives next to the garden. I said, do you know anything about the eggplants in the garden being pulled up? Nope. Earlier in the week, the flowers at the playground sign that the city had been pulled up. They had planted some beautiful petunias, and they had been pulled up. And Emma texted me one morning and said a little guy in her class who also lives in the neighborhood had told her that he saw two individuals, my mentee and another individual, hiding and pulling up these flowers. And so I said, well, you know anything about the flowers at the sign? No, it wasn't me. And his reaction was different enough. I knew he didn't know anything about the eggplants necessarily, or it wasn't him. And I knew he did know and was a participant in the flower deal. And so a little while later, after we were talking to him, he confessed that it was the other little boy in the neighborhood who was also in his class who had pulled up the eggplants. And so when I took him back to the class, I asked the teacher if I could talk to the other little boy. And he said yes. And so we went out in the hall. And I squatted down because I like to get on their level. I don't want to be a big, tall person imposing over them. I just wanted to have a conversation. And so I asked him, I called him by name, and he knows me. He knows me well. And I said, did you pull any eggplants in the garden? Yes. Well, why did you do that? That's somebody's food. And, we talked about how that, if he doesn't like eggplants, which he doesn't, there are lots of people who love eggplants, and how he just ruined it for a whole bunch of people in the neighborhood who absolutely love eggplants. I mean, 26 eggplant plants produce a lot of eggplants, and they're always gone. People love them. And so we talked about that, and I asked him not to, and I didn't threaten, I didn't want to punish him, I didn't act angry. I just told him I wasn't happy and that it wasn't a good thing, and I hoped that he would think about it before he did any more damage like that in the garden, that he wouldn't do that. And it was an opportunity to extend open arms to this little boy. I went from there to the garden after mentoring to plant the eggplants that I had left. I had said I wasn't going to buy any more, and I didn't buy any more, but I had 23 left. Now it's 2 varieties instead of 3, but it is what it is. And so I planted them, and as I was finishing planting them, the mother of my mentee came, and we had a long conversation. And I had not realized that also that morning, the kids, while they were waiting for the bus stop, had taken the books out of the little library and used them as baseballs and hit them with baseball bats all around. And all the books were out. And she said she watched it. And then she picked them up and put them back. And I don't know why she didn't stop them, but, and she wants me to take the little library out of the garden because it's nothing but trouble. And I'm thinking, well, teach your children. How to respect other things. No, I'm not taking it out. There is value there. And anyhow, in that process of that conversation, and why I'm telling you this is, I discovered that the little boy who pulled the eggplants, Dad, is in jail. She also told me, the neighbor also told me, that his mom was diagnosed this week with cancer and has a month to live. Now, I'm not sure that's true or not. I do know that the dad's in jail, and that alone. I mean, this little boy is when he's medicated, he's a really good kid, and when he's not, he's really out of control. And I've seen it firsthand, so I'm not exaggerating. But just having your dad in jail is enough to cause you to act out. And if I had been angry at him, I would have missed that fact that the cause of some behaviors is these things that, especially as children, that we don't understand, and that happened to him that he can't control. I mean, yes, he could have controlled pulling those eggplant out, but he needs our open arms. And we are that same, we are also that little boy. Maybe you didn't pull the eggplants out of the Camden garden, but you pull eggplants all the time in God's eyes. And aren't you grateful that He opens His arms wide and welcomes you and invites you into the salvation and grace and love that He extends? And if He does that to us, don't we need to do that to one another? It totally changes the world we live in. And it opens up the possibility for someone to walk away from the desire to pull up eggplants in their lives. So it's my prayer and hope, brothers and sisters, that responding with open arms will open up the possibility of transformation in our lives. Our lives and the people that we interact with's lives. Because, brothers and sisters, at the core of joy are people who have open arms. Because Jesus has open arms.